It had just been a week since my son got out of the hospital when my husband moved out. My son was only 8 years old, and he'd been recently diagnosed with autism, and he had to go to the hospital because of some pretty challenging behaviors related to his disability. And my husband was actually my second husband, so my son's stepdad, and he'd been a really good stepdad. He taught my son to read, and he taught my son to ride a bike, and he really loved him, and he was all in. On the day of our wedding, he put a medallion around my son's neck, and he promised to love him like his own son. But something about the hospital just broke him, and he bailed. He moved out when we weren't even there, and he didn't tell us where he was, and I was only allowed to call him one time a week for 20 minutes. And for months, we lived like this, and my son was a mess because he just got out of the hospital, and the special ed nanny had quit, and I had this new job at a startup that I knew I couldn't keep if this man didn't stay in my life. And for the entire time he was gone, I just kept telling him, no matter what you need, I'll do it. I am all in. I love you so much. I am here to give you whatever you need. And so after a couple months, he asked to sit down and have lunch. He said, I'm finally ready to share with you what I need. And I was so excited because I knew I was ready to give it. And so when I showed up at this really mediocre Mexican restaurant and sat down with him, he slid this piece of paper across the table at me. And in big letters at the top, it was like, husband's needs. He has a name, I'm just not gonna use it. And underneath that, he had listed out very clearly all the most difficult symptoms of my son's disability. And next to each one, he said, I will no longer tolerate this in my home. And I looked at this list and I said, this is impossible. How could you ever expect this? No 8-year-old can agree to never have a behavioral challenge, let alone a disabled one who just got out of the hospital. And he said, I don't know if it's possible or not, but it's just what I need. And I said, what are you possibly expecting from me? Like, what do you want? Do you want me to send him away? And he sort of perked up. And he said, well, if that's what it takes. And I said, where do you think he's gonna go? And he said, that's not my problem. And then he said the most incredible thing. He said, I love you so much. And I love your son, and I miss you, and I wanna come home and be a family again. And in that moment, it wasn't so much a decision as this chasm opened inside my chest. And on one side was this dream of a life we were going to have together as a blended family. And on the other side was the life I was now going to lead. And I pushed the paper back across the table and I said, you promised me you would never make me choose. And I got up and I left the restaurant, and he wrote up the divorce paperwork that night. And it's been years now, and if I haven't found my way to forgiveness, I've found my way to some sort of peace, because I have had to go to the mat for my son again and again and again. And the gift that man gave me is there was never going to be a cost worse than the one I had already paid, which means there was never going to be a barrier to advocating for him that I couldn't do. And that day in the Mexican restaurant, when I made that decision that was not a decision, what I realized was my son, who is a beautiful and bright and curious, delightful soul, he deserves nothing less than complete belief in him and unwavering support. And anything less than that will no longer be tolerated in my home.
Like and subscribe to experience more heartwarming stories. Discover the magic of how making one life better can bring light and joy to your own.